This presentation examines the origins and the aftermath of the terror attacks of 9/11/2001. Its purpose is to demonstrate the complexities of historical events and how historians attempt to examine them. On the day of the attacks, most people reacted with horror and bewilderment. The attacks seemed to be a bolt from the blue. Why would someone do something like that? Simplistic explanations were put forward that a group of religious fanatics did it because they hated America for its freedom. But as we shall see in this presentation, the causes of the attack go much deeper and further back than the lives of the men accused of the hijacking. They involve foreign policy decisions stretching all the way back to the early 1950s and involve economic and political interests both in the United States and abroad. The full story of 9/11 may never be known. We're left with many unexplained and seemingly unexplainable developments. What we do know is that in the aftermath of the attacks, America underwent profound changes. On the morning of September 11th, America enjoyed relative peace. It has not enjoyed peace since, finding itself constantly embroiled in wars around the world. Bellicose and militant nationalism have reared their ugly head, and people are now more prone than ever to accept invasions of their privacy and the militarization of the police on the dubious grounds that such changes will make us safer. Military and police budgets have exploded, and as have the budgets of federal agencies, and the economy finds itself in seemingly terminal decline. The rich and politically connected have gotten richer and more powerful, and the middle class is slowly declining as inflation eats away the value of the dollar, pushing more people into poverty and reliance on government aid. Where will this end? One can only speculate. To explain it all, we need to go back to the early 1950s and half a world away in Iran. During the Second World War, the nation of Iran was occupied by both British and Soviet forces. Though they would later become enemies during the Cold War, the British and Soviets were at that time allied with one another against Nazi Germany. As agreed at the Yalta Summit, Soviet and British forces both withdrew from Iran after the war. Before British military forces withdrew, the British had set up the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, now part of BP, or British Petroleum, to exploit Iran's significant oil wealth. The post-war government of independent Iran was democratic, but when the Iranian people elected a socialist named Mohammad Mossadegh, it worried both the British and the American governments. They worried that Iran might become a Soviet satellite or ally. Mossadegh also enraged the British when his government nationalized or took over the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company's oil fields and production facilities. Urged on by the British and fearful of Soviet expansion in the Middle East, American President Dwight Eisenhower approved a plan to get rid of Mossadegh. It was called Operation Ajax. The plan was for American agents to contact anti-Mossadegh elements in Iran, primarily in the Iranian military and among Iran's wealthy elite, and offer American support for a coup that would remove Mossadegh. The plan worked, and the coup replaced Mossadegh's democratic government with a new pro-American military dictatorship. The head of this new dictatorship was a young aristocrat named Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, whose father had claimed to be the rightful king of Iran. Pahlavi now crowned himself the new king, or Shah, of Iran, and the Shah's government then cracked down ruthlessly against all opposition, both from the socialist and communist supporters of the deposed Mossadegh, as well as opposition from Islamic religious leaders who opposed the Shah's plan to westernize Iran. With American assistance, the Shah modernized his military forces and set up SAVAK, a ruthless security police force which became known for torturing and killing the regime's opponents. The American public paid scant attention to any of these developments, and almost no one in America knew the extent of American involvement in the coup and subsequent brutal crackdowns. Most Iranians, on the other hand, knew all about America's complicity in the coup that removed Mossadegh and of America's support for the Shah. Though America postured as a defender of freedom and democracy, Iranians knew that America had been largely responsible for putting a ruthless dictator in power in Iran and then keeping him there for the next quarter century. Overall, the American government was quite pleased with its new ally in the Middle East. The American government saw the Shah as both a modernizing reformer and an anti-communist bulwark against the Soviet influence in the region. Within the CIA, however, there were some concerns over the long-run consequences of what they had done in bringing the Shah to power. In one report, an analyst noted, "We may get some blowback from this action," meaning that ultimately this whole escapade may come back to bite us in some unexpected way in the future. Until Operation Ajax, the United States was highly respected and generally well thought of among the people of Iran and other Middle Eastern countries. American complicity in the overthrow of Mossadegh and America's support for the hated Shah would begin to change that. It would be some time before the blowback would become apparent. The Shah was successful for a time in keeping his opponents off balance and suppressed. Also, with U.S. assistance, Iran grew into significant regional military power, allowing the United States to station agents and military personnel in Iran to monitor the Soviet Union just to the north. In 1979, however, the Shah's acceleration of his drive to westernize Iranian society, combined with rampant corruption in his government, produced a popular backlash. Led primarily by conservative Shia Muslim clerics, popular demonstrations in major cities broke out. This time Savak was either unwilling or unable to control the situation, and the Shah was eventually forced to flee the country, first for Egypt and eventually to the United States, where he sought medical treatment for cancer, from which the Shah died a short time later. With the Shah gone, his government collapsed. A power struggle ensued in Iran between communist and socialist political parties and various religious parties and groups. Eventually, a Shia Muslim cleric by the name of Ayatollah Khomeini emerged on top. In America, Khomeini was cast as the ultimate evil villain. With his black robe and turban and full beard, Khomeini was always shown on American television with a fierce, angry expression. A figure of hate and fear in America, Khomeini captured the popular imagination of the people in Iran, however. Huge crowds of mainly young people cheered him on as he denounced the Shah as an American puppet. Once in power, Khomeini promised to restore Iranian democracy and to rebuild Iran along traditional Islamic lines. He also promised a clean and modest government, uncorrupted by the extravagance of the Shah's regime. In addition, Khomeini demanded that the United States return the fugitive Shah to Iran to stand trial for his crimes. When American President Jimmy Carter refused this demand, an angry mob of young Iranians stormed the American embassy in Iran's capital, Tehran. They took most of the embassy staff hostage, threatening to kill them all if the Shah was not returned. Though the hostage-taking was not planned or approved by Khomeini or his government, the Ayatollah eventually backed the young hostage-takers as a means of solidifying his own hold on power, still under challenge by communist and socialist elements in Iran. In response to the hostage-taking, the U.S. cut off diplomatic relations with Iran and imposed severe economic sanctions as anti-Iranian feeling exploded across America. Yellow ribbons were hung on trees in a public display of support for the hostages, who were held in Iran for over a year. The yellow ribbon idea, by the way, came from a then popular Tony Orlando and Dong song titled Tie a Yellow Ribbon. The American Academy Award-winning movie Argo portrays the drama of the Iranian hostage crisis that was headline news throughout 1979 and 1980. While the U.S. was busy with Iran, the Soviet Union was more concerned with events just to the east in neighboring Afghanistan. There, a pro-Soviet communist government was also under threat from Islamic radicals. To avoid an Iran-style revolution in Afghanistan, Soviet troops crossed the border, allegedly at the invitation of the Afghan government. American President Jimmy Carter condemned what he called Soviet aggression and demanded the Soviets withdraw from Afghan territory. The Soviets, of course, ignored Carter. The U.S. and other Western countries refused to send teams to the 1980 Moscow Summer Olympics, and America briefly embargoed grain exports to the Soviet Union, but the Soviets did not leave Afghanistan. More serious, though, and not as widely known, was that the U.S. also began to aid the Islamic rebels who were now fighting the Soviet invaders. The rebel group called themselves the Mujahideen, or Holy Warriors. CIA agents entered the country supplying the Mujahideen with guns and ammunition, and eventually with sophisticated shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles called Stingers. These missiles were used very effectively by the rebels to shoot down Soviet attack helicopters and other low-flying aircraft. One of America's new Muslim allies in Afghanistan was a Saudi exile named Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden and the Mujahideen hated the atheistic communists and wanted to establish an Islamic republic in Afghanistan and in other Islamic countries. Bin Laden was the son of a wealthy Saudi, but his opposition to the Saudi monarchy got him kicked out of Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden was also an enemy of Iraq's Saddam Hussein and other secular or non-religious Arab regimes. Americans had very little interest or understanding of the complexities of Middle Eastern tribal and religious conflicts at the time. American foreign policy was based on unwavering support for Israel and opposition to communism and the expansion of Soviet influence, wherever it might occur. America's support for bin Laden and the Mujahideen would have serious consequences later on, both for America and for Afghanistan. Meanwhile, to the west of Iran, Iraq's ruthless dictator Saddam Hussein saw an opportunity. Fearful that Iran's Islamic Revolution might inspire the mostly Shia Muslim population of his own country, particularly in the south, and coveting disputed Iranian territory along his eastern border, Hussein launched a massive military invasion of Iran. Hussein badly miscalculated Iran's military potential, however. Though no longer supported by the military might of the United States, Iran's military was still formidable, and its young soldiers were fired by revolutionary zeal. The Iranians threw the invading Iraqi forces back onto the defensive, and for the next 8 years the war ground down into a bloody stalemate. Many observers describe the relatively static front line as resembling World War I trench warfare, with deadly mass assaults repelled by poison gas, machine guns, and artillery. Officially, the United States remained neutral in this conflict, supporting neither side. Unofficially, however, the United States was deeply involved, supporting both sides. Though Saddam Hussein's socialist government in Iraq was somewhat allied to the Soviet Union and supplied with Soviet military hardware, Saddam gladly accepted covert aid from the United States as well. The photograph in the lower left center shows President Reagan's special envoy, Donald Rumsfeld, meeting with Saddam Hussein in Baghdad during the war. Ironically, the very same Donald Rumsfeld would serve as George W. Bush's Secretary of Defense and call for war against his old friend. America and its ally Israel saw both of their interests best served by prolonging the Iran-Iraq war for as long as possible. Though the economic sanctions and other laws passed by Congress in the wake of the hostage crisis forbid American trade or aid to Iran, the Reagan administration was covertly supplying the Iranian military through Israel with ammunition and spare parts for its American-made weaponry left over from the Shah's time. At the same time, America was supplying Saddam Hussein's Iraq forces with intelligence and other aid that would help Iraq destroy the very same weapons. The situation got quite complicated. The Americans repeatedly found themselves caught in the middle of two warring countries. In 1987, the American frigate USS Stark, then operating in the Persian Gulf, was inexplicably attacked by an Iraqi MiG fighter jet. 37 American sailors were killed when the ship was hit by 2 missiles fired from the Iraqi jet. The Iraqi government claimed the ship was hit by mistake. The next year, the American guided missile cruiser USS Vincennes shot down an Iranian passenger airliner, killing civilian passengers and crew. The U.S. government claimed the crew of the Vincennes mistook the airliner for an attacking Iranian F-14 Tomcat. This, even though the jetliner was significantly larger than an F-14 and was climbing at the time of the attack. The Iranian government condemned the U.S. killing of innocent Iranian civilians and even issued a postage stamp shown on the slide to further inflame the Iranian populace against the great Satan America. In 1988, the United Nations brokered a ceasefire in the war between Iran and Iraq. The terms of the ceasefire left both countries right where they started off, with no significant changes in the border or status of either country. In other words, this war, like all other wars, was totally pointless. The war, however, left both sides devastated. Over 1 million were dead on both sides, and both Iran and Iraq were economically crippled. Iraq claimed to have started the war to defend the Sunni Muslim Arab states against the threat of Shia Muslim Iran. Hussein felt the other Arab states owed Iraq for its sacrifice. Iraq felt its small wealthy neighbor to the south, Kuwait, was particularly ungrateful. Saddam Hussein accused the Kuwaitis of both cheating on the oil production agreements intended to keep the price of oil high, and of illegally engaging in horizontal drilling from Kuwait into Iraqi oil fields. After consulting with the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, April Glaspie, who assured Saddam that the U.S. took no interest in Arab-to-Arab disputes, Saddam launched a full-scale military invasion of Kuwait. Kuwait's tiny military force was easily swept aside by the battle-hardened Iraqi military, and shortly thereafter Hussein announced that Kuwait had ceased to exist and would now be part of Iraq. Despite Glaspie's assurance of neutrality, then-President George H. Bush immediately condemned the invasion of Kuwait and dispatched a massive military force to the Persian Gulf. Saudi Arabian King Fahd was convinced to allow the stationing of U.S. troops on his country's soil to protect his oil fields from possible Iraqi invasion of his own country. The stationing of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia, however, greatly offended many religious Saudis, like our old friend Osama bin Laden. Other Arabs felt the presence of American troops in the Middle East was a prelude to a U.S. takeover of the region. They felt the U.S. was using the Iraq-Kuwait war as an excuse to insert themselves onto Arab land. Other Arab nations, however, joined the Americans, both in exchange for military and economic aid, and to settle scores with old enemies. Though justified as a defensive operation, once the American force in Saudi Arabia was in place and of sufficient strength, the U.S. launched a massive invasion of Iraq. After months of intense aerial bombing, U.S. ground forces quickly flanked the Iraqi forces in Kuwait, forcing them into a headlong retreat to the north. As the Iraqi army retreated, they were bombed and strafed from the air along what became known as the Highway of Death. Seeing an opportunity to get rid of Saddam Hussein, Iraqi Kurds and Shiite rebels rose. Rather than support the rebellions, however, President George H. Bush ordered U.S. forces to halt their advance into Iraq. U.S. forces then stood aside and allowed what remained of Hussein's army to finish off the rebels and re-establish control of Iraq. Though American forces then withdrew from Iraqi territory, they retained a significant presence in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia for the next decade, allegedly to defend against any future Iraqi aggression. The United States also sponsored measures of the United Nations to punish and contain Iraq via crippling economic sanctions that the UN now estimates may have resulted in the deaths of more than 500,000 Iraqis in the decade to follow. America had made yet another enemy. Though in America the First Gulf War was seen as a glorious victory over an evil tyrant, it was viewed quite differently in the Arab world. Prior to the Gulf War, Iraq had the fourth largest military force in the world, equipped with modern Soviet-built tanks as well as sophisticated fighter and bomber aircraft. Palestinians living under Israeli occupation looked with hope to Iraq. Saddam Hussein was a vocal supporter of the Palestinian cause, even if only for his own cynical reasons. With the destruction of Iraq as a regional military power, however, there was no longer any realistic chance of an Arab military victory over Israel. Many Palestinians thought this was the American purpose in the first place, to serve Israeli security interests and destroy any hope of Palestinian statehood. As for Iraqi Kurds and Shia Muslims, they saw America's premature withdrawal from Iraq as a betrayal, and increasingly looked to Iran for support. What now appeared to be a permanent American military presence in the region also greatly angered Arab nationalists and religious leaders in many countries. Secular Arab leaders who had gotten too cozy with the Americans now appeared to the Arab street as traitors and sellouts, catering to America and Israel rather than looking out for their own people. These leaders, like Egypt's Hosni Mubarak, Jordan's King Hussein, and the Emir of Kuwait, lived in luxurious palaces guarded with American weapons, if not guarded directly by American soldiers. The people in the Arab street became increasingly angry, frustrated, and radicalized. The CIA termed it blowback. Blowback, revenge really, is the undesirable but predictable consequences of an otherwise successful military or political operation. In 1993, a group of radical Islamic militants drove a truck laden with high explosives into the basement parking lot of the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York. They detonated the bomb under the building's main supports, intending to cause the tower to fall over into the South Tower, destroying both buildings and killing thousands of Americans. The buildings did not collapse, however. But 6 people were killed in the blast in the North Tower's lower levels. The perpetrators were eventually captured, tried, and convicted of the crime. One of the planners, Ramzi Youssef, claimed they did it to send a message to Americans. Youssef wanted America to stop aiding Israel and to stop meddling in the affairs of the Arab world. Then again in 1998, the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were bombed, killing over 200 people. A group calling itself Egyptian Islamic Jihad claimed responsibility. Finally, in 2000, the USS Cole, a Navy destroyer then refueling in Aden, Yemen, was attacked by 2 men in a small rowboat who detonated a bomb as they rowed alongside the ship's hull. 17 U.S. sailors and the 2 bombers were killed in the blast, and the Cole nearly sank from damage below the waterline. By the end of the 1980s, the Soviet Union had had enough of its Afghan occupation. Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev ordered a withdrawal. Afghanistan had never been kind to invaders, and the Soviets were no exception. Perhaps they should have learned from the British, who also invaded Afghanistan in the 19th century. The painting above here depicts the British retreat from Kabul back in 1842. Out of some 16,000 British and Indian soldiers who occupied Kabul back then, only 1 army surgeon and a handful of Indian soldiers managed to survive the retreat from the city. The Soviets lost some 15,000 men in their 9-year occupation of the country. The Soviet retreat from Afghanistan left a power vacuum, and it was not long before civil war broke out between various warlords and tribal groups. Eventually, a group calling itself the Taliban, led by a Muslim cleric named Mullah Omar, took control of Kabul and most of the countryside. A smaller group called the Northern Alliance remained entrenched and continued fighting the Taliban in the north of the country. Americans took little interest in any of this. With the Soviets gone, no one saw any reason to take an interest in this faraway mountainous land with its warring tribesmen. Americans often have a difficult time distinguishing between the Taliban and al-Qaeda. The Taliban was effectively the government of most of Afghanistan. Though never recognized as such by more than a handful of countries, the Taliban and Mullah Omar, consisting mostly of Afghans' majority Pashtun tribe, controlled the capital and much of the rest of the country. Al-Qaeda, or the base, on the other hand, was a loosely knit organization of mostly non-Afghan Arabs. It was set up by Osama bin Laden during the war against the Soviets to help the Afghans expel the communist invaders. Now bin Laden hoped to liberate other Muslims from the grip of Western imperialism. Though the American government had worked with bin Laden and his Mujahideen during the war against the Soviets, they now became bitter enemies. America was not bin Laden's only enemy, however, or even the primary enemy. Saddam Hussein regarded bin Laden and al-Qaeda as threats to Iraq's secular, non-religious, and socialist regime, and various Gulf monarchies sought to crush al-Qaeda, fearful that it would stir revolution among the poor, who resented the extravagant lifestyles of the wealthy aristocrats living off their kingdom's oil revenue. Bin Laden saw all the Arab governments as corrupt and godless and mere puppets of the United States, which had bribed their leaders into submission and betrayal of their Palestinian cause. The Arab streets saw bin Laden as an incorruptible hero who would restore Arab pride and stand up to the interests of ordinary Muslims. As for 9/11, the official story goes like this. A group of 19 men, all known members of al-Qaeda, somehow entered the U.S. legally and moved around the country freely, planning an attack. Then, armed only with box cutter utility knives, they all boarded 4 commercial airlines on the same morning, again without attracting any notice from the FBI, and hijacked the planes. Despite barely being able to fly small-engine Cessnas after briefly taking flying lessons at a small commercial flying school in Florida, the men then skillfully navigate and fly these comparatively huge and complex aircraft into the World Trade Center towers, and with almost impossible precision, into the side of the Pentagon's ground floor, without leaving so much as a scratch on the lawn in front. A 4th plane then inexplicably all but disappears into a hole when it crashes into a field in Pennsylvania, leaving no wreckage or any identifiable bodies or luggage. In fact, this was true of all 4 of the airplanes. Where did the wreckage go? Within hours of these events and without any investigation, the Bush administration publicly blames Osama bin Laden's network for organizing and carrying out the attacks, and the media is posting pictures of the hijackers. Though bin Laden states that America had gotten what it deserved for all it had done to the Muslims in the Middle East, he emphatically denies any responsibility for the attacks. One has to wonder, could the attacks have been a setup? Were the hijackers mere patsies? Like Lee Harvey Oswald in the Kennedy assassination, were the hijackers pawns or fall guys in a much larger plot that they were totally unaware of? If so, who were the actual plotters and what were their motives? Declaring the attacks an act of war rather than the crime they were, President Bush demanded that the Afghan Taliban turn bin Laden and his associates over to American authorities and close down his training camps or face serious consequences. U.S. military forces began positioning themselves for an invasion of Afghanistan. The Taliban government did not outright refuse President Bush's demand, but they did demand to see evidence of bin Laden's guilt before agreeing to extradite their old friend and ally. The Bush administration refused to provide such evidence. Did it have any? We still do not know. A month later, U.S. forces began bombing Taliban positions and aiding the Northern Alliance warlords in Afghanistan. Conflating the Taliban with al-Qaeda and convinced of bin Laden's responsibility for 9/11, Congress and the American people largely went along cheering on the attacks against a country and government that likely had nothing to do with what happened on 9/11. Meanwhile, Congress passed the USA Patriot Act, a massive bill of over 1,000 pages that apparently had been drafted long before the attacks even occurred. The bizarrely named Patriot Act greatly expanded police powers to spy on Americans for their own safety, of course. A new and powerful Federal Department of Homeland Security was also created, and both military and intelligence agency budgets were greatly increased in order to fight what President Bush called the global war on terror. In the wake of 9/11, many Muslims, both foreign and American, were rounded up and held without trial, some for the crime of having contributed to the wrong Islamic charity, for example. Some of these individuals have spent over a decade in places like the infamous Guantanamo Bay concentration camp in Cuba. Many were tortured for information while in U.S. military custody. In the wake of 9/11, America had become a police state. Since Afghanistan was landlocked and surrounded by countries generally unfavorable to U.S. interests, getting ground troops in there proved problematic. Though neighboring Pakistan's military and security forces had helped the Taliban and the U.S. against the Soviets, they were reluctant to turn on their old ally now that the U.S. and the Taliban were enemies. The U.S. in effect both threatened and bribed Pakistani dictator Pervez Musharraf, promising support if he cooperated and cutting off aid and even possibly invading Pakistan if he did not. As President George W. Bush once famously said in a speech to Congress, "You are either with us or you are with the terrorists." Musharraf and his generals decided to cooperate with the U.S., though the policy remains highly unpopular on the streets of Pakistan. Though the Taliban was driven from the major cities by the U.S. invasion, they continue the fight to the present day, mostly in the countryside and in the rugged mountains. Bin Laden and most of his al-Qaeda network managed to escape Afghanistan into northern Pakistan. Bin Laden was allegedly killed by a U.S. Navy SEAL team about 10 years later, but doubts remain about this story. No body was ever returned as proof, and Bin Laden's supporters say he died years earlier from kidney disease. Like the Soviets before them, the Americans now find themselves bogged down in a seemingly hopeless struggle against a determined Afghan enemy. Ironically, American pilots in the initial attack even feared being targeted by the very same Stinger missiles the Reagan administration had supplied the Mujahideen to use against the Soviets in the 1980s. The sons of what Reagan called the Afghan freedom fighters were picking up where their fathers left off. Then there's the strange case of Iraq, Gulf War II. If one war were not enough, the Bush administration turns its attention on our old foe and old ally Saddam Hussein in Iraq. For more than a decade under President Clinton, Iraqis had suffered under punishing UN sanctions put in place at the insistence of the United States. The U.S. continued to maintain a robust force in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia after the first Gulf War in 1991, but they were beginning to wear out their welcome. The Saudi monarchy was particularly sensitive to accusations that it had become an American puppet regime, and though American troops in Saudi Arabia were told to largely stay in their barracks and to steer clear of the local populace, cultural and political friction was growing. Americans needed a new base of operations in the Middle East, and out of this came the sudden accusation that Saddam Hussein was developing and hoarding weapons of mass destruction, that is, nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. Though Hussein denied having or developing any such weapons and permitted UN inspectors to come to Iraq and look for them, the U.S. invaded anyway. This time the Americans continued on to the Iraqi capital Baghdad, forcing Saddam Hussein to flee. Hussein was later captured, turned over to his Iraqi enemies, and executed. Iraq then descended into complete chaos as rival tribal, religious, and political groups fought with both the American invaders and with each other for the next 8 years. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis were killed in the Second Gulf War, and really an Iraqi civil war, as were over 5,000 U.S. soldiers. Many Americans believe the U.S. invaded Iraq to avenge the 9/11 terror attacks, but there was zero evidence that Iraq, like Afghanistan, had anything to do with 9/11. When pressed, President Bush eventually admitted they had no evidence that Saddam Hussein had anything to do with 9/11, and no weapons of mass destruction were ever found by U.S. forces in Iraq, so the pretext for the invasion turned out to be apparently false as well. Only recently have the majority of U.S. combat forces been removed from Iraq, but the U.S. still maintains a substantial military and political presence there. Though a new government has been established under U.S. supervision, its hold on power has largely relied on U.S. economic and military support. The Iraqi civil war continues as street violence and bombings occur on a regular basis. Like many historical events, this one is complicated. Its chain of causation reaches far back in history and to too many different far-flung places. The hijackers of 9/11 were likely motivated by a long chain of perceived abuses and wrongdoing by America's government that result in the deaths of millions of people in the Middle East and beyond. To get to the truth of the whole plot, the historian must look deeper than the surface and refuse to accept at face value official explanations. Certain people benefited tremendously from 9/11 and its aftermath. Perhaps that would be a good place to start. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 after a failed coup in Moscow, the U.S. military no longer had any significant enemies to worry about. Pressure grew during the Clinton administration to cut military spending, which would have meant less employment and profits for the huge defense industries, what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, that had become dependent on Cold War-level spendings. The Middle Eastern wars and occupations have not only restored military spending levels to Cold War levels, but have pushed them beyond those levels. Large American oil companies have also benefited from lucrative oil and gas concessions by the new puppet governments in Iraq and Afghanistan. Though Afghanistan is not oil rich or rich in most of anything else, its territory provides an excellent path for a pipeline for the Caspian Sea oil to reach the Persian Gulf without having to go through the still unfriendly Iran. As awful as they were, the terrorist attacks also came at a convenient time for President George Bush. Some would even suggest a little too convenient. George W. Bush entered the White House under a cloud. The legitimacy of his election in 2000 was disputed as the result of an unbelievably close and disputed vote count in the state of Florida, and many of his opponents regarded him as inarticulate, unintelligent, and uninspiring. His popularity ratings in most polls were well below 50% at the time of the attacks. Following the attacks, the country rallied around the president, who called for war against what he called evildoers. The rapidity with which the perpetrators were identified, as well as the very strange and inexplicable way in which things went down during and after the attack, left many mysteries and but unmistakable results. 9/11 transformed America in ways that few would have imagined possible on September 10, 2001. Few would have imagined that the U.S., then at peace with the world, would find itself embroiled in not one but two wars halfway around the globe, or that laws like the USA Patriot Act would give police and the government's intelligence agencies sweeping new powers of search without warrant, or of eavesdropping on virtually all communications, or that Americans choosing to fly would be subjected to invasive body searches and irradiation just to board an airplane. All of this would happen at a time when the last major power capable of challenging the U.S. on the global stage, that is the Soviet Union, had disappeared, and global peace and prosperity seemed at last to be possible. Who would desire a profit from such a result? In the 1999 movie The Matrix, the character Morpheus offers Neo a choice between taking a red pill or a blue pill. If he chooses the blue pill, he will wake up in his bed and be as ignorant of what is going on as he was before he and Morpheus met, and likely think their meeting was just a dream. If, on the other hand, he took the red pill, he would, as Morpheus put it, find out, like Alice in Wonderland, how deep the rabbit hole goes. As we embark on the study of U.S. history, which will it be for you, the red pill or the blue pill? Why would we care, though? Why not take the blue pill? What is done after all. Americans will likely never forget 9/11, but one has to wonder whether they'll ever learn anything from it. Currently, the U.S. government seems to be making the same mistakes that led up to 9/11. We continue to foment war and revolution throughout the Middle East, supporting a military coup in Egypt and propping up a dictatorship there, while giving aid to extreme Islamic rebels in Syria, many of whom are believed to be members of Al-Qaeda. Thousands of Arab Muslims continue to die as American flags burn in the streets of Cairo and Damascus. After the French Revolution, the famous French diplomat Talleyrand once said of the French Bourbon kings, "They learn nothing and they forget nothing." Could the same be said of the American people and their government today?